The Ottoman Empire did not execute most women taken into the imperial court. That is the first misconception. Death was not the usual outcome. Disappearance was. When these women crossed into the world of the court, they were not erased from existence. They were reworked. Their lives continued, but in a form that no longer belonged to them. Names were replaced. Languages faded. Memories became liabilities. The person who arrived did not survive intact. From the outside, it looked like mercy. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Survival did not mean freedom. It meant adaptation under pressure so constant it reshaped identity itself. Every gesture learned, every word corrected, every trace of origin slowly stripped away, not through violence alone, but through routine. Nothing about this process was accidental. It was orderly, intentional, repeated. These women were not meant to be remembered as they were. They were meant to be useful, legible to the system that absorbed them, and silent about the lives they once had. What could not be controlled was removed. What could be repurposed was preserved. History often treats this as a softer fate, but survival under these conditions came at a cost few records bothered to calculate. Because what happened next was not punishment, it was redesign. To understand why the Ottoman imperial court took women alive, we have to set aside modern assumptions about mercy and cruelty. Because what guided this system was not compassion, it was utility. On the battlefield, violence was blunt and immediate. Armies crushed resistance, destroyed supply lines, and made examples of those who could fight back. Death there was fast, public, and symbolic. It ended threats. But the court was not a battlefield. It was an engine. And engines do not destroy what they can repurpose. Women taken into the imperial court were valuable precisely because they were not combatants. They did not represent military resistance once captured. Instead, they represented something far more useful to an empire that fought in generations rather than moments. Alive, these women could be reshaped. Dead, they were finished. The Ottoman system understood a distinction many empires came to rely on. Conquest did not end with territory. It ended when identity itself was absorbed. This is where the logic shifts. On the battlefield, domination is enforced through fear. Inside the court, domination is enforced through structure. Women were taken alive because they could be made to serve the empire in ways that extended far beyond the moment of conquest. Their survival was not an exception to violence, it was part of a longer strategy. Alive, a woman could become political capital. Marriages, alliances, court placement, proximity to power, these were not personal matters, they were mechanisms. Every woman inside the court existed within a hierarchy designed to stabilize rule, reward loyalty, and neutralize potential opposition before it formed. A woman who came from a defeated region carried symbolic weight. Her presence alone was a reminder of where power now resided. She did not need to speak for this to be understood. Her survival inside the court quietly reinforced the message that resistance ended not in annihilation, but in absorption. This is why death was often considered wasteful. Execution removes a body, absorption removes a lineage. Alive, a woman could also be cultural leverage. The Ottoman court was deeply aware of culture as a political force. Language, religion, etiquette, memory, these were not neutral. They shaped loyalty. They shaped belonging. Women brought into the court carried cultures with them, and rather than allowing those cultures to persist intact, the system slowly replaced them. New languages were learned, new customs enforced, new rhythms of life normalized. Over time, the past became distant, impractical, even dangerous to remember. This was not done all at once. It was done gradually. That slowness mattered, because conversion, cultural, religious, behavioral, works best when it feels inevitable rather than imposed. The goal was not to erase identity violently, but to make the old identity unlivable.
Alive, a woman could adapt. Dead, she could not. And then there was reproduction, the most misunderstood aspect of all. From the outside, it is easy to assume that women were taken primarily for sexual reasons. This assumption is convenient, sensational, and incomplete. What mattered far more than desire was continuity. Empires survive by reproducing themselves. Children born within the imperial system, raised in its language, educated in its worldview, loyal to its structure, were assets. They embodied the future of the state. Through them, conquest became permanent. This is why women were not only taken but trained. Education inside the court was not generosity, it was preparation. It ensured that if a woman became a mother, the next generation would belong entirely to the empire, not to the culture that came before it. Alive, a woman could carry the empire forward. Dead, she could not. What emerges here is a pattern that feels unsettling because it is so rational. The Ottoman court did not rely on constant terror inside its walls. It relied on predictability. Roles were defined, advancement was structured, favor had rules, even if those rules shifted. Violence was present, but it was not chaotic, it was conditional. And this distinction matters. On the battlefield, violence ends resistance. In the court, violence, or the threat of it, maintains compliance. Women were taken alive because they could be placed into systems where choice slowly narrowed, where survival required adaptation, where resistance became impractical, then unthinkable. This is why comparing battlefield violence to court absorption misses the point. Battlefield violence destroys bodies. Court absorption reshapes lives. One is loud, the other is quiet. And history has always struggled to name quiet harm. To outside observers, especially later chroniclers, this system could be framed as opportunity. Some women lived in luxury, some were educated, some rose in status. But this framing ignores a critical truth. None of this began with consent. Value inside the court did not erase the fact of capture. Privilege did not negate the loss of autonomy. Survival did not restore what had already been taken. And this is where the language of mercy becomes dangerous. When an empire takes someone alive, it is tempting to see restraint, but restraint in this context served a function. It allowed the empire to extract more labor, more loyalty, more future stability than death ever could. Destruction is immediate, conversion is enduring. This logic did not require cruelty to be constant, it required it to be possible. The system functioned because everyone inside it understood the limits, even if those limits were rarely spoken out loud. That understanding shaped behavior far more effectively than force alone, and it explains why women were more valuable alive than dead. Alive, they could be watched. Alive, they could be shaped. Alive, they could be made useful. But usefulness is not the same as power. The structure that kept women alive was the same structure that kept them contained. Advancement was permitted, but only within boundaries defined by others. Influence was possible, but always conditional. And that brings us to the final and uncomfortable distinction. Being taken into the Ottoman imperial court did not mean entering power. It meant entering a system where power was proximity, not possession. Where survival depended on alignment, where safety was temporary, where identity was negotiable but never fully one's own. Because what the court offered was not authority. It was inclusion, on the empire's terms. And entering the court did not mean entering power.
When people imagine women taken into the Ottoman imperial court, they usually imagine a single space, a harem, a place of luxury, intrigue, whispered power, silk curtains, and proximity to the throne. That image is not entirely false, but it is dangerously incomplete. Because the imperial court was not a room, it was a system, and systems do not function on fantasy, they function on hierarchy. The court was a tightly organized institution with rules, ranks, surveillance, and consequences. Every woman who entered it was placed somewhere within a structure that determined what she could do, who she could speak to, and how visible she was allowed to be. Understanding this structure is essential because it explains why so few women ever rose and why the idea of opportunity inside the court was mostly an illusion. At the lowest level were captives. These were women newly absorbed into the system, often from conquered territories, borderlands, or regions already weakened by war. Their identities were the most fragile at this stage. Names were often changed, languages replaced. Previous social status meant nothing. A noblewoman outside the court entered at the same level as a peasant. Here, survival meant compliance. Observation was constant. Movement was limited. Mistakes were remembered. Advancement was not promised. It was merely implied. Above them were servants. Service was not a step up in dignity. It was a step deeper into the system. Servants were expected to internalize court etiquette completely. They learned how to move, how to speak, how to disappear when necessary. For many women, this was the final destination. Years could pass here, decades even. Youth faded, visibility declined, the court continued. Most women never moved beyond this level. This is a critical point often lost in popular imagination. The court did not function as a talent pipeline where merit guaranteed advancement. It functioned as a filter, narrowing possibilities over time. Then came consorts. This is where myth takes over and reality becomes harder to see. Consorts were visible, but visibility was not power, it was exposure. Favor could elevate someone temporarily, but it also made them vulnerable. Favor shifted, preferences changed. What was rewarded one year could be punished the next. A consort's position was never secure. It depended on attention that could vanish without explanation. And crucially, not all consorts mattered politically. Many passed through this stage without leaving any trace in the historical record at all. Above them were mothers of princes. This was the highest position a woman could realistically attain, but it was also the most precarious. A mother's status was tied entirely to her son's survival and prospects. If a prince fell of favor, so did she. If he died, her influence vanished overnight. Her power was never independent. It was borrowed and always conditional. And even here, the system was unforgiving. Rivalries were structural, not personal. Women were not competing because they were cruel. They were competing because the system forced scarcity. Advancement for one often meant erasure for another. This hierarchy explains a harsh truth. The court needed many women to fail for a few to rise. Popular imagination focuses on exceptions, the rare figures who achieved influence, whose names survived. But focusing on exceptions distorts reality. For every woman remembered, hundreds disappeared quietly into the machinery of the court. The illusion of opportunity was essential to maintaining order. If advancement appeared possible, compliance felt rational. Hope became a tool, silence became strategic, resistance felt unnecessary, even dangerous. But opportunity without control is not freedom. It is management. The court offered movement, but only forward, never outward. Once inside, there was no return to what came before, no restoration of identity, no public acknowledgement of loss. Women did not simply live in the court, they were contained by it. And this containment was subtle. The system did not rely on constant punishment. It relied on predictability, on routine, on the gradual internalization of rules. Over time, the boundaries became invisible. This is why the harem myth persists. Luxury distracts from structure. Beauty obscures confinement. Exception hides the rule. The lived reality was quieter. Days structured by expectation, lives shaped by proximity rather than choice. Futures narrowed not by violence, but by design. And for most women, there was no dramatic fall, no tragic execution, no story worth recording. There was simply continuation, inside a corridor that stretched forward without exits. Advancement was possible, but rare. Power was visible, but unreachable. Identity was preserved only if it did not interfere with obedience. And this is the most unsettling truth of the system. The imperial court did not need to crush everyone. It only needed to absorb them. Because for most women, the court was not a ladder, it was a corridor. The story did not begin at the gates of the imperial court. It began much earlier, in places that history rarely lingers on. Villages at the edge of empire, border towns, coastal settlements, noble households weakened by war, regions where treaties blurred into tribute, and tribute blurred into surrender. Women entered the Ottoman system through many doors, but almost none of them were voluntary. Some were taken during raids, swift, disorienting events where the rules of ordinary life collapsed in a single morning. Homes were searched, possessions scattered, families separated by urgency rather than cruelty. There was no speech explaining what was happening. There was no certainty about where anyone was going. Others were absorbed through tribute systems, formal, bureaucratic, almost quiet. Communities were required to give up bodies as part of political agreements. Daughters, cousins, dependents. Paperwork replaced screams, but the result was the same. And then there were diplomatic transfers. Girls offered as part of alliances, hostages in everything but name, sent away not as prisoners but as guests, a word that softened what could not be refused. These paths differed in tone, but they converged in outcome. Once selected, a woman became movable. The first rupture was separation, from family, from familiar voices, from the geography that made memory stable. Whether she left in haste or under ceremony, the moment she crossed that threshold, her previous life lost all legal relevance. Transport was the next phase, and it mattered more than we often realize. Journeys were long. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Movement across languages, climates, landscapes. Roads that erased familiarity with every step forward. For women taken from inland regions, the sea itself became a border, terrifying, infinite, indifferent. For others, mountains replaced horizons, cities appeared and vanished, faces changed, accents shifted. The journey was not simply physical, it was psychological recalibration. Every mile widened the distance between who she had been and who she would be expected to become. Memory had no reinforcement. Names were no longer spoken. Family stories found no audience. By the time many women arrived near the imperial center, they had already begun to feel unreal, like someone who had outlived their own life. And then came the first formal act of control, renaming. It did not always happen immediately, but it always happened deliberately. A new name was assigned, often one that fit the court's linguistic and cultural framework. Names that carried meanings approved by the system. Names that erased geography. Names that removed lineage. This was not cosmetic. Names anchor memory. They link people to family, place, history. Changing a name did more than signal ownership. It rewrote identity. A woman's original name was rarely recorded, rarely preserved, often lost forever. Once renamed, she could no longer be called back by the world she came from. This was the moment survival took its true cost, because from this point forward, everything familiar became dangerous. Speaking one's native language marked difference. Difference invited scrutiny. Scrutiny delayed advancement. Silence, by contrast, smoothed assimilation. So languages were abandoned, sometimes forcibly, sometimes strategically, sometimes slowly until one day the words simply didn't come anymore. Family identity followed the same path. Surnames dissolved, tribal affiliations vanished, noble lineages were rendered irrelevant. A woman who had once been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's future,
became simply part of the court's internal order. Memory itself began to feel unstable. When no one around you shares your past, the past becomes fragile. Stories unspoken start to feel unreal. Details vanish. Faces soften. Survival demanded adaptation, not resistance. This is a crucial point often misunderstood. These women did not forget because they were weak. They forgot because remembering had consequences. The system rewarded absorption. Those who adapted quickly were marked as promising. Those who clung to their origins were labeled difficult, slow, unsuitable. And suitability determined everything. Even grief had to be managed carefully. Public mourning was discouraged. Emotional excess signaled instability. The court prized composure, not honesty. So grief was internalized, and internalized grief reshapes identity. By the time a woman entered the inner layers of the imperial court, she had already undergone multiple transformations. None of them were visible to outsiders. None of them were recorded as violence. And yet each one removed a layer of self. This is why the phrase "taken into the court" is misleading. It suggests arrival. What actually occurred was replacement. The woman who crossed the empire's borders was gradually overwritten by someone else, someone more useful to the system, more predictable, more silent. This process did not require cruelty in the obvious sense. It required time. Time to separate, time to rename, time to make return impossible. By the time a woman stood within the walls of the imperial complex, the hardest part had already happened. She had survived, but not intact. Her survival marked the beginning of disappearance. And this is the emotional truth at the center of the system. The Ottoman court did not need to destroy women physically. It transformed them structurally. And transformation, unlike death, left no witnesses. Because the woman who arrived was not the woman who entered.
When we hear the word education, we often think of opportunity, growth, possibility. But inside the Ottoman imperial court, education meant something different. It was not intended to empower. It was intended to contain. For women newly absorbed into the court, learning began immediately, and the first lessons were deceptively simple. Court etiquette. Every gesture, every posture, every manner of speaking carried meaning. Standing too tall, bowing incorrectly, gazing inappropriately, these were all measured. Correction was constant, sometimes gentle, sometimes rigid. Every misstep signaled inexperience. Every success signaled compliance. Mastery was less about skill than about assimilation. These lessons were not offered as instruction for life. They were a training regimen to mold women into predictable, controlled participants. Courtesy was not celebrated. Obedience was. The subtlety was key. When a woman believed she was learning a privilege, she was internalizing compliance. Religion. Conversion was rarely violent. It was methodical. Women learned rituals, prayers, and observances not only to fit in, but to become legible to the hierarchy. The outward expressions of devotion became a measure of loyalty. In time, belief itself could be reshaped, not by force alone, but by routine, expectation, and repetition. Silence. Perhaps the most insidious form of control was the lesson in quiet. Speaking without invitation, questioning decisions, or recalling the past could carry consequences. The court prized women who understood that restraint was more valuable than speech. Over time, silence became instinctive, and with instinct came compliance without thought. All of these lessons were framed as privileges. You are educated, the system suggested. You are trained in refinement. You are prepared for influence. Kindness and attention were folded into structure. Rewards, small approvals, access to better quarters, proximity to power were handed out to those who followed the rules. Rewards were never generous. They were strategic. The court offered enough comfort to encourage repetition and obedience. and always with the unspoken reminder that removal or restriction could be instantaneous. In this way, obedience became psychologically rewarding, and resistance became psychologically costly. A small act of defiance could provoke isolation, scrutiny, or public correction. Over time, women internalized the lessons. To survive, adaptation was mandatory. Compliance was safer than expression. Here lies the subtle cruelty. This was not coercion in the obvious sense. This was coercion by conditioning. When the system shows kindness, when it offers privileges, the mind begins to calculate risk differently. The same mechanisms that might inspire gratitude or loyalty elsewhere were here turned into tools of containment. Every lesson, every reward, every correction trained the mind to anticipate surveillance, to internalize limitation, to desire compliance. Imagine a young woman learning that speaking out could cost her favor, that failing to bow correctly could mark her for disapproval, that remembering her past, her family, her origin could be dangerous. These were not abstract rules, they were survival strategies, learned slowly, daily, with constant reinforcement. The court offered a paradoxical existence. Privileges existed, rewards existed, comforts were real, but freedom, true, self-determined freedom, did not exist. Education here was a mirror. It reflected a life where success appeared attainable, but only on the empire's terms. Women were taught to value the very structures that restricted them. They were encouraged to embrace lessons framed as opportunity, even as those lessons tightened the constraints around them. And because the rewards were real and the consequences real, resistance became psychologically difficult. Questioning the system meant questioning the path to survival. To refuse was not only dangerous, it was isolating. To remember the past was tempting fate. To assert independence could feel like stepping into a void with no support. Over time, even the memory of choice eroded. Compliance became instinctive. Obedience became identity. In this context, the line between privilege and conditioning blurred. The court's attention felt benevolent, the structure seemed protective, and the pathways forward appeared to promise influence. And yet, beneath it all, was quiet control. This is the zone viewers feel discomfort, not horror, not the immediate shock of violence, but the subtle unease of realization. Because here, kindness is a tool. Pleasure becomes a mechanism. Training is a means of control dressed as opportunity. The Ottoman imperial system relied on this psychological architecture as much as it relied on walls, guards, and protocol. Survival was less about escaping danger and more about internalizing constraint. Women learned that the smallest misstep could shift perception, that the difference between reward and restriction was nuanced and constant, that compliance was profitable and deviation costly. Each lesson reinforced a single truth. The empire valued predictability over freedom, and obedience was its currency. It is also crucial to note that this education was ongoing. Learning did not stop after arrival. Every year, every interaction, every ritual reinforced the rules. Proximity to the center of power intensified observation. Women who had successfully adapted were watched more closely, not less. Mastery was never complete. The court demanded perpetual recalibration. And so the court became an ecosystem where intelligence, skill, beauty, and talent were valued, but only when they served the structure. Individuality could exist, but only as long as it did not challenge hierarchy. Success was conditional. Survival depended on constant vigilance. The final unsettling truth emerges here. The education offered to these women, framed outwardly as refinement and privilege, was a system of subtle, ongoing coercion. It was a mechanism that slowly reshaped the mind, the body, and ultimately the very sense of self. Kindness taught compliance, privilege enforced obedience, silence became instinct, and resistance, no matter how small, carried a cost too high to risk. The women who learned these lessons well could navigate the court. They could survive and even achieve limited influence.
But survival was never empowerment. It was adaptation. It was containment. It was mastery of the rules without mastering freedom. And this brings us to the natural transition for the next section of the story, because obedience, as essential as it was only the first requirement.
In the imperial court, one of the most misunderstood aspects of women's lives is the role of intimacy. Many assume it was about desire, attraction, or personal choice. Those assumptions are misleading. Here, relationships were not personal. They were political. Consent, in the modern sense, did not exist. The very structure of the court made it impossible. Every interaction occurred within a framework where power dictated opportunity. A woman's life, movement, and status were controlled from the moment she entered the court. Her body, her labor, her proximity to influential figures, all were assets to be deployed by the system. The line between private and public blurred, and control was never in her hands. Survival depended on navigating this imbalance carefully. The imbalance of power was extreme. Men at the top, sultans, princes, or senior officials, had authority over life, privilege, and legacy. Women had influence only insofar as it served the empire's objectives. Being noticed could be a fleeting opportunity for advancement, or it could mark the start of danger. No favor was permanent. No attention guaranteed protection. Reproduction, too, was never merely a personal matter. Children born within the court served as instruments of continuity for the empire. Every pregnancy was political. Every child carried the possibility of consolidating power, reinforcing alliances, or strengthening claims. Women were valued not as people, but as conduits for lineage, living vessels in a larger, calculated system. Favor was a double-edged sword. The very visibility that could provide privileges also placed women under constant scrutiny. Being noticed might offer comfort, influence, or proximity to resources, yet it also increased exposure to risk. Social missteps, misunderstandings, or changes in hierarchy could quickly turn advantage into danger. The structure of the court ensured that power, not intimacy, determined interactions. Every relationship was a transaction, often invisible to outsiders but acute in consequence. The court rewarded compliance, punished misalignment, and used attention strategically. Pleasure, if present, was secondary, incidental to a system designed to maintain control. Women quickly learned the subtle rules. They understood which behaviors offered safety, which gestures were interpreted as loyalty, and which moments of assertion could threaten survival. This constant calculation shaped daily life, constrained choices, and created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The psychological toll of this environment cannot be overstated. The most dangerous moment was often being noticed, not the act itself. Visibility brought scrutiny, judgment, and the possibility of exploitation. In a system where every action was monitored, the eyes of authority were as powerful as any law. Yet, paradoxically, this same visibility created pathways for adaptation. Women who navigated attention skillfully could gain material comfort, personal influence, or leverage in negotiations. Influence was always conditional, precarious, and mediated through the court's hierarchy. It was never truly free. This delicate balance between exposure and invisibility, influence and danger, defined the emotional landscape of women in the Ottoman imperial court. Every decision was strategic, every interaction had weight, and the system was designed to ensure that control always remained with those who held the power, not those under it. This is the central lesson of this section. The court's intimacy was not about desire, it was about structural power. Women's bodies and roles were managed, monitored, and incorporated into a system of hierarchy. Survival demanded careful navigation of favor, constant attention to shifting dynamics, and relentless awareness of risk.
In essence, sexual power in the Ottoman court was a mechanism of control, not a reflection of personal relationships. And for many women, the most dangerous moments were not those of direct harm, but those in which they were seen, measured, evaluated, and positioned by forces beyond their control. The lesson echoes throughout history. In systems designed to manage lives comprehensively, the appearance of choice can be deceptive. Survival does not equal freedom, and attention does not equal safety. And so, we arrive at a chilling truth. For many, the most dangerous moment was being noticed.
Motherhood is often imagined as a source of safety, influence, and comfort, a role that commands respect, loyalty, and protection. In the Ottoman imperial court, the reality was far more complex, unsettling, and politically fraught. For women who gave birth to princes, the promise of elevation came with a hidden cost: visibility, surveillance, and vulnerability. Becoming a mother of a prince immediately altered a woman's status. She was no longer just a consort or servant. Her child positioned her as a person of influence. She could command respect, affect decisions, and play a role in shaping the next generation of leadership. Outwardly, this elevation seemed like reward, recognition of her survival, loyalty, and skill within the court. Yet this elevation was a double-edged sword. With status came scrutiny. Every word, every gesture, every interaction was observed and interpreted. The same eyes that had previously tolerated her presence now measured her influence and intentions. In the empire's logic, maternal power was inseparable from political risk. A mother could be leveraged, manipulated, or removed depending on her son's fortunes. Sons themselves became liabilities. A young prince was a potential threat to rivals, a tool for alliance, or a symbol around which factions could rally. His existence created tension. The boy's mother carried his future within her body and presence, but her bond was never purely personal. Every affection, every instruction, every act of protection could be viewed as maneuvering for influence. Even the smallest act of care could be interpreted as ambition, a subtle threat to the court's hierarchy. This environment turned maternal bonds into political hazards. Imagine nurturing a child whose very existence could provoke envy, suspicion, or reprisal. Imagine knowing that the affection you feel could be weaponized against you, or that your loyalty could be doubted at a single misstep. In the Ottoman court, motherhood was not a shield, it was a magnifying glass. Every success and failure, every moment of connection was amplified under the relentless observation of the system. Even survival for these women depended on others' ambitions. Court officials, advisors, and competing consorts all had stakes in the child's future. Aligning with one faction could provide protection temporarily, but it also meant alienating another. The mother's agency was not eliminated, but it was tied to forces outside her control. The court's hierarchy turned familial love into strategy. Maternal instinct could become calculated intervention. The child's welfare was inseparable from political calculations. Obedience and diplomacy were no longer sufficient. To protect oneself and one's child, a mother needed to read alliances, anticipate rival moves, and navigate loyalties with precision. And even mastery of the system offered no guarantee. Elevation increased visibility, but it also intensified risk. A woman who had successfully survived the challenges of education, obedience, and favor now faced the heightened dangers of influence. Mothers could be accused of plotting, manipulating succession, or conspiring with foreign powers. Their sons could be kidnapped, exiled, or killed, acts that simultaneously punished and controlled the mother. The illusion of safety was deliberate. The system rewarded competence and loyalty with proximity to power, but never with certainty. Every maternal bond carried potential reward, but also an equal potential for loss. Success could bring wealth, comfort, and influence, yet failure could bring invisibility, isolation, or worse. Even the court's rituals reinforced this fragile position. Public appearances, ceremonial duties, and observances magnified scrutiny. Mothers could appear gracious, humble, or dutiful, but the performance was always evaluated against perceived ambition. The very act of being a mother of a prince was politicized, transforming private bonds into instruments of court control. This twist, that motherhood, so often imagined as protective, could instead amplify danger, was a central mechanism of the system. It reinforced obedience, incentivized vigilance, and ensured that even elevated women remained contained within the empire's design. The stakes of this role were psychological as well as practical. Mothers lived with constant tension: how to care for their child without attracting suspicion, how to display affection without being labeled manipulative, how to navigate alliances while maintaining safety. Every decision carried multiple layers of consequence, and the smallest misstep could cascade into real danger. Yet, despite the risks, many women adapted. They learned to balance affection with strategic discretion, to combine nurturing with observation, and to leverage their influence without appearing ambitious. Survival required a constant negotiation of emotion and calculation. The emotional reality was stark. Power in the Ottoman court was conditional, fragile, and always contingent on external forces. A mother could wield influence, but it was a power tethered to her son's fortunes, to rival ambitions, and to the unyielding scrutiny of those who controlled the system. The higher she rose, the more visible she became, and with visibility came inevitable exposure. Ultimately, the system taught a profound lesson. Protection and risk were inseparable. Every elevation brought new hazards. Every advantage introduced new vulnerabilities. Mothers could achieve influence, but at the cost of constant vigilance and the perpetual possibility of loss. This section illustrates the core tension of the Ottoman court's hierarchy. Agency was never complete, elevation was never safe, and even the most intimate human bonds could be weaponized against the very women who nurtured them. As we consider the lives of these mothers, one truth emerges with clarity. The imperial court did not offer simple safety or linear reward. It offered visibility, and with visibility came risk. A mother's survival was never just about her own choices. It depended on the ambitions, calculations, and actions of others. Thus, motherhood in the Ottoman court was a trap disguised as privilege. The very role that should have provided protection, influence, and comfort instead increased exposure, intensified scrutiny, and amplified danger. This brings us to the final line for this section, a line that crystallizes the paradox of power, survival, and maternal bonds. Survival now depended on someone else's ambition.
In every system designed to absorb and contain, there exist anomalies, individuals who manage against the odds to ascend. Within the Ottoman imperial court, a handful of women navigated its intricate hierarchy and gained remarkable influence. Their names occasionally survive in history. Their stories sometimes emerge as tales of triumph. Yet the reality is far more nuanced. Their success, rare though it was, carried costs invisible to the casual observer. The women who rose to power did so not by breaking the system, but by becoming part of it. They learned its rules quickly, mastering the subtle patterns of attention, obedience, and favor. They understood how to appear loyal, how to read the ambitions of those around them, and how to anticipate shifts in influence before they became threats. These were not small achievements. In a system designed to erase, homogenize, and control, to stand out at all required extraordinary skill. Yet with every step upward came sacrifices that were profound. The first casualty was origin. Women who ascended had already left their homes behind, sometimes years before. Their families, languages, and cultures became distant memories. In many cases, these memories were actively suppressed, for to dwell too long in the past invited suspicion. To survive, to thrive, meant to detach from the world that wants to find them. What outsiders might call adaptation was in reality a form of erasure.
Loyalty, too, became a fluid concept. Within the court, allegiance was dictated not by sentiment but by necessity. A woman could not remain steadfast to her birthplace, her family, or even her own instincts if those loyalties conflicted with the shifting priorities of the empire. She had to recalibrate constantly, balancing political alliances, courtly rivalries, and the ambitions of others. This was survival disguised as strategy, and it exacted a heavy psychological toll. Memory, both personal and collective, was another casualty. The act of remembering who she had been, the life outside the palace walls, the relationships that had shaped her, the ideals that had guided her, was perilous. To recall too vividly was to risk scrutiny. To dwell in the past was to challenge the present order. In ascending, women became architects of their own selective amnesia. The narrative of their lives was rewritten daily, not by choice but by necessity. Power within the court was inseparable from assimilation. Influence was rarely derived from charisma or talent alone, it was earned by becoming indistinguishable from the system itself. To wield authority meant mastering the language, the rituals, and the expectations that the court imposed. Every advancement required compliance with unspoken norms. Every gain demanded the gradual relinquishing of self in favor of the identity sanctioned by the empire. These stories are often misread. To outsiders, the women who rose appear to have achieved agency. They are celebrated as survivors, strategists, and even visionaries. Yet what is frequently overlooked is that their agency was conditional. It was power granted by a system that controlled every variable, every relationship, every opportunity, every gesture. Their influence existed not because the system empowered them, but because they conformed to its demands more skillfully than most. Success, in this sense, was a form of adaptation, a calculated navigation of structures designed to contain rather than liberate. The cost of such adaptation was psychological and emotional. To live as an influential woman in the Ottoman court required constant vigilance. Each interaction was measured, every alliance could shift. A single error in judgment, a misread signal, a moment of excessive trust, a lapse in etiquette could undo years of careful positioning. The stakes were unrelenting, and the pressures cumulative. What appeared as authority externally was often internalized tension, a perpetual balancing act between visibility and vulnerability. Even material comforts did not equal freedom. Proximity to power allowed women access to privileges, better quarters, access to resources, sometimes even the ability to influence decisions, yet these were bounded by the imperatives of the court. Privileges were revocable, influence was negotiable. The very mechanisms that conferred status were also instruments of control, reinforcing dependence on a system that demanded constant surveillance of self and others. It is essential to recognize the subtle paradox here. The women who succeeded were both powerful and constrained. Their lives challenged the simple narrative of triumph. In gaining influence, they sacrificed origin, autonomy, and unmediated selfhood. What appeared as liberation was in truth the mastery of constraints imposed by others. The court allowed influence, but only within its own carefully designed parameters. Viewer engagement deepens when we consider this. These stories invite reflection on the nature of agency itself. Was this agency, the ability to shape outcomes and affect decisions within the court, genuinely personal? Or was it a form of adaptation, a skillful negotiation of imposed boundaries? The answer is complex. The women were neither powerless nor fully autonomous. They existed in a state of negotiated control, where influence came at the price of complete integration into the system that had initially absorbed them. Their legacies are equally complicated. Historical records often celebrate them as icons of female power, but the reality was more precarious. The very documents that preserve their names were created by the same structures that defined their lives. These narratives emphasize accomplishment while often omitting the psychological and emotional cost of maintaining that position. Influence, after all, came with the constant reminder that any advantage could be rescinded in an instant. Consider the subtleties of perception. A woman's power could be misinterpreted as ambition, a child's favor could be viewed as manipulation, a ceremonial gesture could be read as defiance. Every success contained within it the seeds of scrutiny. To survive, to thrive, was to develop an extraordinary sensitivity to nuance, a capacity for patience, and a willingness to subordinate personal memory and loyalty to the imperatives of the court. Even the rare instances where women exercised meaningful decision-making were mediated by these constraints. Their choices were never absolute. Each action was circumscribed by the invisible boundaries of expectation and surveillance. In effect, power was granted in measured doses, calibrated to reward compliance and test loyalty. The women learned to navigate this environment not as free agents, but as skilled practitioners of adaptation, a delicate choreography of risk and reward. This realization challenges conventional interpretations of historical success. The women who rose did so not by seizing control, but by absorbing the rules of control more effectively than their peers. They became part of the system, using its logic to survive and advance. Their stories are remarkable, not because they escaped the system, but because they learned to function within it at a level few others could achieve. For viewers, the lesson is clear and unsettling. The most visible success in a system of absorption often comes at the cost of selfhood. Elevation required surrender, recognition demanded conformity, authority demanded continuous negotiation between visibility and vulnerability. The women who won within the Ottoman imperial court exemplify a paradox of human adaptation. The very traits that allowed them to survive and influence also ensured their lives were inseparable from the structures that constrained them. And so we reach the section's implicit engagement question, the one viewers are left to wrestle with. Was this agency, or was it adaptation? The tension is deliberate. It encourages reflection, fuels discussion, and sustains attention. As viewers consider the lives of these rare women, they are drawn into the psychological complexity of the court. Influence, privilege, and apparent freedom are reframed not as absolutes, but as conditional phenomena, deeply intertwined with the mechanisms of control that defined the system. Ultimately, the story of those who rose within the Ottoman court is not a simple tale of triumph. It is a nuanced examination of survival, strategy, and compromise. It is about women who gained influence by learning the rules, navigating the system, and mastering the art of adaptation. Yet in achieving these heights, they paid a profound price: the quiet surrender of origin, memory, and loyalty, the psychological weight of perpetual vigilance, and the understanding that power, however visible, was inseparable from constraint.
As we move toward the close of our exploration, it is time to step back and consider the larger patterns that make these stories not just remarkable, but revealing. What we have seen in the Ottoman imperial court, the absorption, the erasure, the invisible mechanisms of control, is often presented in history as routine, even inevitable. And yet, when stripped of euphemism, it is neither routine nor benign. The framing of cruelty as normal is a product of systems, not chaos. The first thing to understand is that the practices of the Ottoman court were not unique. Across centuries, across continents, empires adopted similar strategies. Women in the courts of China, the Mughal Empire, and medieval Europe faced comparable fates. Captivity, control, surveillance, and political manipulation were not anomalies. They were tools of governance, methods by which empires reinforced power, secured loyalty, and maintained hierarchies. Historians often sanitize this reality. The language of administration, obedience, protocol, duty renders cruelty invisible.
Terms like harem or court education are framed as cultural curiosities rather than mechanisms of control. Even when historians document these systems, the focus frequently shifts to the remarkable resilience or influence of individual women, leaving the underlying structure under-examined. This selective focus subtly teaches audiences that what was done to these women was extraordinary only in its spectacle, not in its systemic nature. Violence against women in these contexts becomes administrative. It is choreographed, regulated, and codified. Survival is less about avoiding random harm and more about navigating rules, hierarchies, and expectations. The system doesn't require physical chaos to enforce compliance. Its effectiveness lies in predictability. Everyone understands the rules, and everyone understands that deviation carries consequences. In this way, cruelty becomes normalized, bureaucratic, and almost invisible to those who benefit from it. Consider the role of silence in this system. Silence is both protection and erasure. Women's voices were constrained, stories selectively recorded, and public accounts framed by those in power. What history preserves is often shaped by what happened, not by what was deemed acceptable to record. The invisible labor of adaptation, the quiet survival, the small negotiations, the constant vigilance, rarely enters official narratives. The result is a historical record that appears orderly, controlled, even natural, while hiding profound acts of coercion and suffering. Bureaucracy reinforces this normalization. Imperial systems codified practices to make them routine: who could be taken into the court, how they were trained, how their interactions were regulated, and how their influence could be monitored or curtailed. Each rule, ritual, and record was a mechanism of power. It was invisible because it was expected. It was invisible because it was structured, and it was effective precisely because it operated without overt chaos. Survival narratives further contribute to the perception of normalcy. The stories we often hear highlight resilience, cunning, and rare success. A woman who rises in favor becomes a triumph story. One who survives a decade of constraint is hailed for endurance. These narratives are essential, but they can obscure systemic patterns. They suggest agency, even where structural constraints dominate. They celebrate adaptation without fully revealing the machinery that necessitated it. As a result, cruelty appears exceptional, a feature of individual events rather than pervasive, calculated, and routine. It is crucial to recognize that this normalization does not diminish the cruelty itself. On the contrary, the subtlety of systemic oppression makes it more insidious. Women were not destroyed in isolated acts of violence. They were absorbed, transformed, and continually evaluated within a framework designed to maintain power. The system created the illusion that nothing extraordinary was occurring, that life in the court, however constraining, was natural. The ordinariness of cruelty is what allowed it to persist, quietly, across decades. Historical comparison drives this point home. The Ottoman court's methods of assimilation, surveillance, and controlled favor were mirrored in other societies. In medieval Europe, noblewomen were married off to cement alliances, often against their will, and closely monitored to ensure loyalty. In imperial China, concubines were trained and observed with exacting precision, their fates tied to lineage and hierarchy. The Mughal court similarly absorbed women into structures of power while curtailing personal autonomy. Across these systems, cruelty did not require chaos. It required rules, expectations, and silent compliance. This systemic perspective invites a difficult, reflective question. How much of history is shaped not by extraordinary violence, but ordinary systems of control? By framing oppression as routine, societies create mechanisms of power that are nearly invisible to those within them. The Ottoman imperial court is a stark example, but it is also a lens through which to view larger patterns of governance, gender politics, and historical memory. The final insight here is simple but unsettling. Cruelty doesn't need chaos. It needs systems.
Systems codify behavior, regulate opportunity, and impose consequences. Systems determine which bonds are allowed, which relationships are safe, and which actions are punishable. Within such a system, survival is a continuous negotiation. Influence is conditional, visibility is both privilege and threat, and even motherhood becomes a calculated act of adaptation. For viewers, the lesson resonates beyond historical curiosity. It underscores a broader truth about human institutions. When cruelty is embedded in rules, rituals, and expectations, it becomes normalized. It ceases to shock in the moment because it feels inevitable. The very machinery that enforces harm is invisible because it functions according to predictable, accepted procedures. And this is the final, haunting lesson of the Ottoman court, and by extension, many empires across history. Oppression can be quiet, invisible, and profoundly effective when it is systematically designed. This is where discomfort settles. By reframing cruelty as structural, not exceptional, we confront the subtle power of institutions to shape lives in ways that are enduring and often unexamined. The Ottoman imperial court is a stark example, but it is also a lens through which to view larger patterns of governance, gender politics, and historical memory. The final insight here is simple but unsettling. Cruelty doesn't need chaos, it needs systems. Systems codify behavior, regulate opportunity, and impose consequences. Systems determine which bonds are allowed, which relationships are safe, and which actions are punishable. Within such a system, survival is a continuous negotiation. Influence is conditional, visibility is both privilege and threat, and even motherhood becomes a calculated act of adaptation. For viewers, the lesson resonates beyond historical curiosity. It underscores a broader truth about human institutions. When cruelty is embedded in rules, rituals, and expectations, it becomes normalized. It ceases to shock in the moment because it feels inevitable. The very machinery that enforces harm is invisible because it functions according to predictable, accepted procedures. And this is the final, haunting lesson of the Ottoman court, and by extension, many empires across history. Oppression can be quiet, invisible, and profoundly effective when it is systematically designed. This is where discomfort settles. By reframing cruelty as structural, not exceptional, we confront the subtle power of institutions to shape lives in ways that are enduring and often unexamined. The Ottoman imperial court is a stark example, but it is also a lens through which to view larger patterns of governance, gender politics, and historical memory. The final insight here is simple but unsettling. Cruelty doesn't need chaos, it needs systems. Systems codify behavior, regulate opportunity, and impose consequences. Systems determine which bonds are allowed, which relationships are safe, and which actions are punishable. Within such a system, survival is a continuous negotiation. Influence is conditional, visibility is both privilege and threat, and even motherhood becomes a calculated act of adaptation. For viewers, the lesson resonates beyond historical curiosity. It underscores a broader truth about human institutions. When cruelty is embedded in rules, rituals, and expectations, it becomes normalized. It ceases to shock in the moment because it feels inevitable. The very machinery that enforces harm is invisible because it functions according to predictable, accepted procedures. And this is the final, haunting lesson of the Ottoman court, and by extension, many empires across history. Oppression can be quiet, invisible, and profoundly effective when it is systematically designed. This is where discomfort settles. By reframing cruelty as structural, not exceptional, we confront the subtle power of institutions to shape lives in ways that are enduring and often unexamined. The Ottoman imperial court is a stark example.
As we near the end of our journey into the lives of women absorbed by the Ottoman imperial court, it is worth pausing to consider what we have witnessed. We have explored survival, strategy, adaptation, and the invisible architecture of power. But survival in this context was not triumph in the sense we often imagine. It was a quiet, relentless transformation, a survival that demanded the surrender of self, memory, and origin. To understand this fully, we must step back from the specifics of individual stories and consider the larger reality they reveal. These women lived. They moved through the court, navigated hierarchies, bore children, mastered rituals, and occasionally attained influence. But in doing so, they did not remain the people they were when first taken from their homes. Their identities were absorbed, rewritten, and repurposed to serve the mechanisms of the empire. In this sense, the Ottoman court did not merely enforce survival, it redefined it. Survival became a form of loss. It was a daily negotiation between visibility and invisibility, influence and vulnerability. Every gesture, every alliance, every act of compliance or subtle defiance carried weight. The women who adopted were skilled, intelligent, and resilient, yet their resilience was often invisible in historical accounts. The broader machinery of the court was designed to make their adaptation appear natural, even inevitable, and that is part of the quiet cruelty. The system rewarded compliance while rendering the cost invisible to the casual observer. This is where the concept of history's quiet crimes becomes critical. These are not the headline-making atrocities, the battles, or the executions that dominate textbooks. Instead, they are the subtle, enduring forms of violence that reshape lives without spectacle. The Ottoman imperial court's absorption of women is a prime example. Death, the abrupt and absolute end, is obvious and shocking. What occurred in the court was more insidious. It was a death of identity, a slow erasure disguised as survival, progress, and social order. Consider the paradox. To be alive was to be controlled. To rise within the court's hierarchy was to submit to its imperatives. To retain influence, memory, and loyalty to one's origins had to be tempered, carefully hidden, or abandoned altogether. In this system, life itself became a measured form of obedience. Survival was never simple. It was a negotiated performance, and the stakes were existential. The women who endured were not unscathed. They were reconstructed, their stories often untold, their agency constrained by rules, rituals, and surveillance. Even the rare moments that appear as success must be reframed. Influence within the court was often conditional, visibility precarious, and autonomy always partial. What history occasionally celebrates as triumph, the rise of a consort, the favor of a prince, the elevation to mother of heirs, often masked the quiet, ongoing erosion of identity. In essence, these women survived, but their selves did not. The empire did not merely claim their presence, it claimed their narratives, their loyalties, their memories, and ultimately their autonomy. And yet, this is not a story of hopelessness alone. There is power in recognition, in bearing witness. By tracing these lives, by naming the mechanisms of control, and by examining the subtle cruelties embedded in structured systems, we reclaim fragments of what the empire sought to erase. Reflection allows us to see the human cost of systemic absorption and to recognize the resilience, intelligence, and courage required to navigate such a system. We honor survival not as triumph in the conventional sense, but as testimony to endurance under extraordinary constraints. As we revisit our central insight, the comparison becomes stark. Death ends a life. The Ottoman court, by contrast, ended identities. It did so not with spectacle, not with headline violence, but with procedures, rituals, and expectation. History learned to call that mercy, and in that misnomer, the true nature of the crime remained hidden for centuries. Survival was framed as privilege, adaptation was praised as agency, silence became the historical record. Our task as storytellers, as witnesses to these quiet crimes, is to disrupt that silence. These stories were not written to be remembered. They were absorbed into broader narratives of empire, efficiency, and governance. The subtleties of coercion, the slow erosion of identity, the psychological weight of perpetual vigilance, these aspects were intentionally minimized, codified into routine, and normalized. And so we tell them, so that the lessons they carry are not lost, so that the human cost is not erased. The final reflection is unambiguous. The women who entered the Ottoman imperial court did not vanish physically, but the empire sought to erase them in every other sense. Their names, their voices, their personal histories were subject to the imperatives of power. The court did not need chaos to enforce dominance. It relied on systems, rituals, and the quiet, enduring pressure of expectation. Their survival became a testament to both the human capacity for adaptation and the insidious efficiency of structured oppression. As the video closes, viewers are left with these lines, soft, reflective, and branded to resonate. Death ends a life. The Ottoman court ended identities, and history learned to call that mercy. And finally, the spoken soft call to action, designed to keep the viewer thinking. These stories were not written to be remembered. That's why we tell them.